It's Sunday, July 28th, and a very strong storm is set to impact the northern plains to northern Midwest today, specifically in parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin, where we do have a slight risk of severe weather, then a associated marginal risk, which stretches all the way down into parts of Iowa, then back through most of Wisconsin, and even into parts of eastern South Dakota. Then we do have a little marginal risk out here in parts of the mid-Atlantic. And then we could expect to see some record-breaking weather down here potentially in the southeast. Now today's risk is mostly going to be wind driven, with the highest risk of seeing some winds up here in our northern Midwest risk area, and I actually think there is a pretty decent chance of seeing this risk upgraded and also seeing some hurricane force gust in excess of 75 miles an hour. Then in this 5% risk area, there is just that conditional threat for some 60-mile-an-hour damaging gusts, and the same thing goes back here in our mid-Atlantic risk area. And then for our hail threat, it's not really going to be very large at all. And it's going to mostly be only back here in our northern Midwest risk area. And it's actually going to stretch down into parts of eastern South Dakota. Now, the reason this is so small is because it's going to be mostly a linear mode. And I actually do think this could be upgraded in a corridor stretching more in the southern parts of our risk area, stretching from Minnesota into Wisconsin with those storms in their earlier stages. I wouldn't be surprised to see some hail in excess of 1.5 inches. Then our last area of severe weather is going to be our tornado risk. There is a large 2% chance of some weak spin up tornadoes, with I do think potentially a corridor for some stronger tornadoes with the earlier stages of our storms today in that same corridor I mentioned for that hail. But the main threat would be some weak spin up tornadoes along a line. And then that record breaking weather that I talked about in the southeast is going to come in the form of some extremely hot temperatures. These are the feels like temperatures, and we're expecting to see a lot of high 100s in the southeastern seaboard. And as we push further into the day, we are going to see this trend migrate a bit more westward, and actually it's going to extend very high up all the way into the northern plains, with some feels like temperatures all the way up into South Dakota being in the low 100s. And this would extend pretty much the entirety of the Great Plains, and then even our southeast area would still be experiencing some high 100 feels like temperatures. And this would span a very large chunk of the US, even including our river valleys, the Great Plains, which we already talked about, most of the Gulf Coast states, and back into the southeast, and even parts of the Midwest as well, where there is expected to be some high 90s all the way into low hundreds feels like temperatures. And our risk of excessive rainfall is going to be pretty isolated, but the areas which will see this could potentially see some very large swaths of rain. And our slight risk areas, one up here in parts of northern Minnesota, then our other two back in parts of the Ohio River Valley, then into the northeast, could see anywhere between 1 to 4 inches of rain, with a couple of isolated areas predicted to be even around 6 inches of rain up here in parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Then in our marginal risk areas, which pretty much just surround our slight risk areas, there is the pretty strong threat for large swaths of 1 to 2 inches of rain. Now here is what our storms are going to look like today, and we can see that the ingredients are going to start to get laid with yesterday's storms, or even early into this morning's storms, which could pose some severe threats, mostly in the form of some damaging gusts around 60 miles an hour. But we're going to see that we have a couple of remnant mesoscale convective vortexes, a cold front, and then we're also going to have some troughing aloft to help with the initiation of these storms. And the redevelopment along these vortexes would likely be a very strong line of thunderstorms. In the earlier stages of this line, we could see a higher threat of some tornadoes. I wouldn't even be surprised to see a stronger tornado, and definitely some larger hail around 1.5 inches in diameter. But the main threat is going to be the very large damaging wind threats. Now, some model runs have predicted 100-mile-an-hour gust. I'm not so sure we'll see gusts that high, but I definitely wouldn't be surprised to see some hurricane force gusts exceeding 75 miles an hour with this storm cluster today. And the highest risk corridor is going to come from central Minnesota into parts of northern Wisconsin. And these storms are going to push through this risk area back into Wisconsin. And the threat with these would pretty much be over in the early night hours around 10 p.m. Now, there is also the conditional threat for some development along outflow left behind from our main cluster of storms, although this would be very conditional, and the main threat with these storms would likely just be a couple of strong severe gusts even if that. And our other risk area back here in parts of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast is just for the conditional threat of a couple of storms bringing some severe gust. And as we can see, it's just going to be a lot of pretty loosely organized and clustered thunderstorms out here, bringing the threat for potentially some flooding and some damaging gusts. Now here are 500 millibar winds, and we're going to see a couple of short waves, actually some pretty strong short waves moving into our main risk area in parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin today, which are also going to be a big contributor in the forcing and development of this linear, very strong line of storms today. And we're going to see it eject pretty much right at the perfect time at the late afternoon into evening hours, which will bring that development for those storms. And we also see that very strong ridge, which has been persisting for quite a long time over parts of the southern US, bringing some of that record-breaking heat. And here's a look at 700 millibars of the same system, and we can see that shortwave bringing quite a bit of 700 millibar flow. Now, what 700 millibar flow can bring is a greater risk for tornadoes and also a greater risk of a stronger line with longer lasting winds throughout. So it wouldn't just be a gust front, and it would be some more prolonged winds for the people affected. And here is a weather sounding, so pretty much just a snapshot of our storm environment with our storms out here in Minnesota and Wisconsin today. And we actually see a pretty big curve on our hodograph. Then our shear and our helicity isn't going to be too poor in the lower levels, but the main hindrance with the tornado threat is going to be the mostly linear storm mode. But in the earlier stages of these storms, I wouldn't be surprised to see a tornado that's not weak, but also not super strong. But the main threat with this would be some weak tornadoes, which would also be supported by our lower lowest cloud level. We also see some very strong organizing shear at around 50 knots, which is a reason for that threat for some organized storms. Also, that could be helped out by some wind veering. Now, something to note is that our hail threat is actually going to be pretty decent. I do think we could see some somewhat large hail because our lapse rates are going to be 8 Celsius decrease per kilometer. We have a very large amount of cape up near our freezing level, but the main hindrance again would be that linear storm mode. But in the earlier stages, I definitely do think we could see some large hail possibly. And then we have quite a bit of dry air aloft, which is going to help to support that strong threat for some damaging gusts. Now, the main thing is going to be some high low level lapse rates, but a extremely moist environment for the region at around a 76 dew point, a extremely unstable environment for the region at around 5,500 cape. So extremely favorable for severe weather. And then our 3 capes also going to be pretty high as well. So just favorable for general severe weather and also that threat for a couple of spin up tornadoes. And our precipitable water is going to be 1.54. Our downdraft cape is going to be 1,000, which isn't actually super high, but definitely conducive for that threat. And then our relative humidity is going to be 37%. So all things that would be conducive for that main threat, which is going to be some strong damaging winds, possibly even eclipsing hurricane force at 75 miles an hour. And this is a snapshot of our environment from our mid-Atlantic into Northeast. And the main thing is that we're going to have a very moist environment with a very unstable environment at around 4,000 cape, also a pretty high 3 cape, so very conducive for just general severe weather today. Then our precipitable water is going to be extremely high at around 2.3, which could also increase the strength of that downdrafts and even bring the potential threat for some flooding in the region. So definitely something to look out for in the mid-Atlantic to Northeast today.